Welcome to Pushback. I'm Aaron Maté. My guest is Jeffrey Sterling. He is a former CIA officer who was imprisoned under the Espionage Act, accused of leaking classified information, an allegation he denies. And he wrote about his experience in the memoir called Unwanted Spy, The Persecution of an American Whistleblower. Jeffrey Sterling, welcome to Pushback.
Thank you very much for having me on.
So it's interesting when you are referred to as a whistleblower because, by your own telling, you are not a whistleblower for what the government accused you of. You had an actual initial case against the CIA that came well before you were indicted by the US government. So let's start there. You served as a CIA officer, and at a certain point, you brought a complaint against the agency. Tell us that story.
The complaint that I brought against the agency was for racial discrimination. When I joined the agency, I, of course, was given the promises of acceptance and equality and equal opportunity. That did not turn out to be the case. Years into my career at the CIA, it became apparent that only because of the color of my skin, I was being denied opportunities. My supervisors even had the compunction, no standoffishness about it at all, to tell me flat to my face that I kind of stood out as a Black guy speaking Farsi, which made absolutely no sense to me. I had proven myself time and time again at the agency in my ability to go to places in the world and to operate in areas where other officers had not been able to. My response to that statement from them was that, when did they realize I was Black, and why to them did it all of a sudden make a difference, particularly as I'm trying to move up in my career. I did sue the agency for racial discrimination. I also took those complaints to both the House Intelligence Committee, as I was permitted to do. I did bring federal suit. That suit was dismissed by the courts, who determined that my bringing my discrimination suit into a public court would pose a danger to the national security of the United States. So in a sense, I was a whistleblower about the discrimination going on at the CIA, and I was prevented from going forward with that because and I still am taken aback by the notion that an African American fighting for his civil rights is a threat to the national security of this country. So in that instance, as a whistleblower, I was quashed, if you will.
And this is where, you mentioned the fact that you spoke Farsi because you specialized in Iran. And this is where that becomes especially relevant because after your discrimination suit is dismissed, your experience with Iran comes back to haunt you. What did the agency do to you after your lawsuit failed?
After my lawsuit failed, and during the intervening time, there was an operation I was involved in targeting Iranian nuclear weapons. It was called Operation Merlin. And through the operation, the goal was to hamper the Iranian nuclear effort, to slow their ability down to gain a nuclear weapon. And I was involved in this operation, which was designed to have flawed plans to a key component of a nuclear weapon instilled into the Iranian nuclear program. My role in this was to train the intermediary who would present himself to the Iranians with the plans. I was given all sorts of assurances that it was approved by the highest levels of government, all the way up to the president, and that there were safeguards built in. The main safeguard was that there was a flaw in the plans that no one would be able to detect, even a scientist. And the purpose then would be get those plans into the Iranian nuclear program. They would use them. The bomb would not work, and it would thereby slow or hamper their development and goal for a nuclear weapon. So I went into this very enthusiastic because I thought it was a great operation and I was proud to be a part of it. But in as we went further with the operation and preparing to the operation, those assurances that I was given about the safety of the operation turned out to be false. The moment that the intermediary first saw the plans that he was to then hand over to the Iranians, he immediately noticed that there was a flaw. This individual was a Russian scientist. He was a Russian nuclear scientist. And I was assured that even he would not be able to detect the flaw in the plans. From the very first moment that he laid eyes on the plans, he immediately said, "This won't work." So that just threw out the window all of the assurances I was given.
Just
I
a
was
just a side question here, just very quickly. What do you think accounts for that misplaced confidence on the part of your superiors at the CIA that there's no way that anybody could detect this flaw?
Well, they were working with one of the national labs. There is a bit of an arrogance, of course, with the CIA that everything done there and done by the CIA is right and can do no wrong. And I think there is also the feeling that, well, we're smarter than the Iranians, so there's no way that they're going to figure this out until too late. And I think that arrogance created a dangerous situation. With this intermediary being able to immediately see the flaw, then my thought was, well, the Iranians will immediately see the flaw as well. And what do scientists do? They fix problems. So instead of hampering their nuclear program, this Operation Merlin would instead probably have sped it up. And we may have seen the Iranians with a nuclear weapon far before anyone would have thought.
And this becomes a huge liability for not just the CIA, but the administration, the Bush administration, right, that approved this. Because if this gets out publicly, then this would be a case of them helping Iran, if that's what Iran wanted to do, which is a separate question,
Yeah,
achieve a nuclear weapon.
absolutely. Yes. And I started, even at the meeting, I brought that point up to my supervisor about the individual noticing the flaw. I was promptly told to shut up. I went to other avenues within the agency to bring this concern up. And the response was pretty much silence. And it was also at that time I was removed from the program, and the discrimination that I had been facing at the agency became intensified. I was at that time stationed in New York. I was removed from there. And I also took the opportunity to go to the Senate Intelligence Committee to let them know about this operation, because during this time, we had gone into Iraq. And I thought that our policymakers should know that there is a potential danger here. There was ample talk of dirty bombs during that period of time. If the Iranians had received these plans, or if they had been given to the Iraqis, there was a possibility that our troops could have been walking into a situation of being destroyed by a dirty bomb or a functional nuclear weapon. I thought that was something that I had to go forward with. I did go to the Senate Intelligence Committee. And shortly after that, I was being investigated as for an unauthorized leak about Operation Merlin.
But yet, during this period, you leave government and you move away. And were you not under the impression that this leak investigation had died down?
Oh, absolutely. I leaving government is a polite way to say it, but I was fired from the agency. They said insubordination, and this was during the time I was fighting when I filed my discrimination suit. And yes, time was passing. I This was in early 2002. By 2003, I had lost everything. I was essentially blackballed in the intelligence community. I was an experienced CIA officer and I spoke Farsi. I had experience in anti-terrorism operations and certainly anti-proliferation operations, yet I couldn't find a job with anyone. I lost everything, and life just took me in different directions. And years pass, and I start my life over again. I have a new career. And then in 2005, I believe the FBI show up at my door. And it just felt like, things were finally over. I got my life back on track. And I don't think anyone can see anything positive of the FBI showing up on your doorstep.
And you end up being indicted for allegedly leaking information about this Operation Merlin to James Risen of the New York Times. When it
Yes.
goes to trial, the government has no direct evidence at all. All they have is evidence that you spoke to Risen at a certain point, and they also have the fact that you complained officially, which is what you're supposed to do, to the Senate Intelligence Committee. So,
Yes.
what case did they make?
The that I was a disgruntled employee. I think one thing that is crucial to point out through all of this, the FBI invigorated their investigation into me when they showed up at my door. I wasn't indicted till about 5 years later. So all this time, I'm trying to just still live my life and all that. And then we finally get to trial, which didn't happen until 2015. So I had the sword of Damocles hanging over me for quite a long time. And during the trial, it was just a CIA show trial. The only thing that was proven beyond a reasonable doubt was that I was black. I certainly didn't look like anyone else put forward by the CIA. And I was just painted as this disgruntled employee who lost, wrongfully, I will say. They pointed out time and time again that I was angry because I lost my discrimination suit, which was, the furthest thing from the truth. The truth was that I wasn't allowed to go forward with my suit. The prosecutor certainly didn't want the jury to know that during this time that I supposedly leaked this information to James Risen, I was still fighting my discrimination suit against the agency.
And James Risen was.
They just painted me as a
Sorry, go ahead. No, no.
all they could do was paint me as a disgruntled employee. I didn't look like anyone else from the CIA. I was obviously angry and without having any proof of anything, which they certainly did not present. All they could do was paint me as a bad guy.
And when you were speaking to James Risen, according to your account, you were speaking to him about that very contemporaneous ordeal you were going through of waging this discrimination case, right?
Absolutely. During the time that I filed the discrimination suit, James Risen wrote an article for the New York Times about that. During the trial, the government admitted that there was no classified information divulged in that article. Yet I somehow then, I guess, lost my mind to the government through my being disgruntled and then leaked classified information to him. All they presented during the trial with regard to contact was phone calls with a duration of maybe 90 seconds, I believe. No conversations, just that there was a connection. And so, again, based on no evidence and just conjecture, uh,
No
convict
passing of any no passing of any material whatsoever. The very thing you're accused of.
absolutely not.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say I'm a lawyer, and I know you have to. The government has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Not only did they not present any evidence, they didn't present or even try to present any evidence showing when, where, or how I passed this information to Mr. Risen. It was an incredible experience and uh, weird. I think it's the best word that I can come up with it. I've had experience certainly with the law, but this that trial was beyond what I certainly learned in law school.
And meanwhile, there were other suspects, I believe, who were never really looked into, including a congressional staffer who was suspected of actually making the leak to Risen, but that avenue was not pursued.
No, not at all. No one was investigated except me. I was the sole target. through the trial, you could understand that there was the moment I started complaining about discrimination at the agency, Operation Sterling, if you will, uh, the mechanisms of that began. And even though it was disclosed at trial that hundreds had access and even access beyond what I had to this operation, yet the focus remained on me. And it was incredible. And again, as you said, one of the staffers that I talked to at the Senate Intelligence Committee after my meeting with them subsequently had been fired from the Senate Intelligence Committee for leaking classified information.
Hmm.
And by the way, also that leak was to James Risen.
Hmm.
So, but none of that made any difference to the prosecutors, the judge, or the jury. To them, I was just that disgruntled black face that didn't fit within the CIA. And of course, he was guilty.
So, from the perspective of looking at why the government would seek to go after you, we have multiple plausible reasons to speculate about. There's the fact that you were alleging discrimination as a CIA official. Also, the fact that you were exposing, as we talked about, hubris and arrogance on the part of a major clandestine program that threatened to deliver Iran with the blueprint to make a nuclear weapon, which would be not just dangerous, but incredibly embarrassing for the Bush administration. But you were also prosecuted under the Obama administration. This is Obama's Justice Department that went after you. Why do you think they took up this case?
Yeah, what was incredible about that is that the Bush administration had dropped the investigation. To them, there was no evidence, and the FBI investigators admitted that it would have made no sense for me to do something like leaking classified information because my discrimination suit was still going on. But when the Obama administration came along, they reopened the investigation. There was no new evidence, nothing at all. I think to that administration, I proved to be an easy target and would be a feather in the cap for Obama and the Attorney General, Eric Holder, to show how they go after whistleblowers or leakers. And I think it was also easy to have me on the stand with their assurances that it would work out okay because, I didn't fit the mold of the upstanding black citizen as Obama and Eric Holder did. So even though Mr. Obama came to be president on the basis of, yes, we can, and all together in a so-called post-racial America. That is exactly what he used and his administration used against me to convict me of a crime I did not commit.
I've heard you say that that kind of very cynical dynamic of pandering to racial resentment and going after you is why they all and to quote unquote respectability politics is why they also called in Condoleezza Rice, the former Secretary of State under George W. Bush, why they brought her in to testify against you, to sort of provide a contrast.
Yeah, absolutely. She did not add anything to the evidence. She was witness to nothing. She vaguely knew about the program, yet she was brought on, I believe, just as a showpiece to show a good upstanding. She was the only other black individual brought to the stand, called as a witness by the government. And that was the one time during the trial that the gallery was full of onlookers to see this former high ranking government official testifying in a trial. She added nothing other than the appearance of here's an upstanding black citizen uh, to be contrasted against me, the disgruntled, ungrateful black citizen.
Do you agree with the notion that our fidelity to whistleblowers is temperamental and not consistent? I'm thinking specifically of during the impeachment trial when this whistleblower who sparked the investigation of Trump allegedly trying to bully Ukraine into launching an investigation, that whistleblower was venerated. And we heard often from Washington, from top-ranking intelligence officials and Democrats especially, that we all worship whistleblowers, and they are they are beyond reproach, and we need to protect them. Do you feel as if there have been, as if that veneration, as if that standard has been inconsistently applied when comparing that case to yours or to Chelsea Manning's?
I don't think there has ever been any sort of consistency with regard to whistleblowers, especially with regard to any protections. Um, what I'd like to say is that I was so glad that whistleblowers and whistleblowing was brought to the fore, um, because of the infamous Ukraine phone call whistleblower. Yet I also there were so many familiarities to me about for me about that as well. When the individual made the complaint about the actions of the president, that information was immediately turned over to the White House and the Attorney General, the very subjects of the complaint. When I went to the Senate Intelligence Committee, little did I did not know at that time that the individual staffers that I was speaking to had either a previous or a current relationship with the CIA. And through the trial, it became clear that the moment I left that office, they went directly to the CIA. So I think our whistleblowing, our system, there are really no protection for whistleblowers, especially on the government level. And it was so disheartening to see so many government officials wanting to know the identity of the whistleblower. And to me, from my experience and the experience of other whistleblowers, that does nothing other than to put a target on that individual and open them up for reprisal and retaliation. So whistleblowers, in a sense of if they're considered a whistleblower by government officials, and that they've done it in an inappropriate way, there will be no protections. And now to use the Espionage Act to go after whistleblowers is a further indication that there is no protections, and it is not a venerated aspect of our government. And you can also see the way other high ranking individuals who clearly break laws are treated. During my situation, what was happening during my ordeal, General Petraeus uh, had been lying to the FBI. He had been divulging inappropriately classified information, yet he received little more than a slap on the wrist. While I was sitting in prison, General Cartwright was pardoned by the Obama administration. So if you're high ranking or if you're liked by an administration, if you will be treated well. If you're viewed as being too outspoken or dangerous in the eyes of the government, you'll be donned as and tried as a whistleblower with no protections. They can say all they want about the protections offered whistleblowers. It will be nice to actually see that in practice.
Well, in terms of someone who is also seen as dangerous and is also being prosecuted under the Espionage Act, like you were, let's talk about Julian Assange. Your case was recently cited by the lawyers acting on the U.S. government's behalf in Assange's extradition case in London. They cited your sentence as a benchmark, and they called that reasonable. What is your reaction to that?
I thought name dropping, throwing my name out as a good example as a benchmark for what sort of sentence Mr. Assange would receive is reprehensible. Um, the Queen's Counsel, of course, being directed by U.S. government attorneys, were trying to appease concerns about the type of sentence Mr. Assange could receive. There's fear that would be hundreds of years. And so said, well, I was sentenced to 42 months, and that's a benchmark for the type of sentence to be received. I thought that was quite disgusting to use a travesty of a trial as a benchmark for what Mr. Assange is facing. What he is facing, if the Queen's Counsel and the UK government really want to know what Mr. Assange is facing with regard to being prosecuted under the Espionage Act, they need look no further than my experience. The government will not have to produce any claims of harm or damage. The government can hide behind classifications to disrupt the defense. And in Mr. Assange's case, I don't think it'll be also the same court that I was tried under. And this is the same circuit, the Fourth Circuit in Virginia, that decided that I could not go forward with my discrimination case. They felt I didn't have any viable civil rights. So I would imagine that Mr. Assange will face an even harsher sort of circumstances if he is extradited.
We're going to wrap, and I want to ask you, just for your closing thoughts, if you could share for people, if you have any words of advice or reflections on for people who are thinking about doing what they perceive as the right thing, but weighing the fact that that would carry adverse consequences for them. What have you learned from your own experience about going through that?
For me, it was that I knew I could not face myself in the mirror. One, if I didn't do something in a situation that I felt I had a duty to do in going forward to the Senate Intelligence Committee with my concerns. And also, I couldn't look at myself ever again, knowing that I pled guilty to something that I did not do. I think if you have it within you to take the necessary steps to disclose wrongdoing, then I think you should go forward with it. I may not be the best example, but at the end of the day, you have to be able to look yourself in the mirror. And from my standpoint, our government becomes better when there are individuals who will not stand for the status quo, who will take the proper steps to bring forward wrongdoing or malfeasance within government. I think that makes government stronger. And the government is certainly using the Espionage Act as a hammer to dissuade anyone from coming forward. But in the end, we do have to come forward. And yes, there is tremendous risk, but I think it's even riskier if people do not come forward. I mean, our government is supposed to be there for us, and it is supposed to be accountable. Whistleblowers make government accountable. And I think if we can stay true to ourselves and still believe in our government and how it can be better, then hopefully people will continue being whistleblowers or even just questioning things and not accepting the status quo.
Jeffrey Sterling, former CIA officer and author of Unwanted Spy, The Persecution of an American Whistleblower. Jeffrey, thanks a lot.
Thank you very much for having me on.